Imagine standing before a crowd of thousands of people who don't just respect you, they believe you are a living god. It is August 3rd, 1929, in the quiet countryside of Amen, Holland. The air is warm, the rows of listeners are perfectly still, and the atmosphere carries the suffocating weight of sacred expectation. These people haven't traveled across continents for casual entertainment or a standard lecture. They have come for salvation. They have come to hear a man who has been meticulously prepared, groomed, and insulated for this exact moment for nearly 20 years. Many in this crowd haven't just given their time. They have surrendered their fortunes, severed family ties, and completely reorganized their inner lives around a singular, massive promise: the arrival of a world teacher. This wasn't supposed to be a mere scholar, a philosopher, or another religious reformer. The global organization backing him, the Theosophical Society, believed this man was a divine vessel destined to usher humanity into a brand new spiritual epoch. A man standing at the center of this universe was Jiddu Krishnamurti. He possessed the kind of power that every politician, cult leader, and guru spends a lifetime starving for: absolute, unquestioned, divine authority. The crowd leaned in, notebooks open, hearts ready to receive a clean, step-by-step path to enlightenment. Instead, he used his very first sentences to systematically destroy the entire movement built in his name. Standing before the very people who worshipped him, Krishnamurti did something virtually unprecedented in human history. He dissolved the wealthy, powerful Order of the Star. He didn't ask for a vote. He didn't offer a compromise. He looked at the sea of expectant faces and uttered words that would send shockwaves through the spiritual world. I maintain that truth is a pathless land, and you cannot approach it by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect. He went on to declare that no organization, no dogma, no priest, no ritual, and absolutely no guru, including himself, could ever lead a human being to reality. This wasn't a quiet bureaucratic resignation. It was a public, spectacular demolition of his own godhood. The man raised to be the ultimate spiritual answer looked at a desperate world and told them to stop looking for answers outside of their own minds. To understand how a quiet boy from India was forced into the robes of a messiah, and why he chose to rip those robes apart in public, we have to look past the grand stage in Holland. We have to travel 20 years backward in time to a lonely, sun-drenched beach in South India. If you had encountered Jiddu Krishnamurti as a child, the absolute last thing you would have predicted for him was a future as a global spiritual icon. Born in 1895 in the small town of Madanapalli, India, he was the 8th child in a destitute, Orthodox Brahmin family. By all accounts, his early childhood was defined by fragility. He was chronically sickly, frequently bedridden with bouts of malaria, and routinely beaten by his school teachers and his father because he appeared to be mentally slow, dreamy, and utterly vague in class. He seemed to look through the world rather than at it. Everything changed with his father, a low-ranking clerk, took a job at the international headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Ojai near Madras. Now, to understand this story, you have to understand what Ojai was at the turn of the 20th century. It was an extraordinary, intoxicating melting pot of ideas. Theosophy was an immense global movement founded by Madame Blavatsky, and by 1909, it had captured the imaginations of elites across Europe and America. It was a bizarre, fascinating blend of Western occultism, Eastern mysticism, claims of telepathic communication with invisible masters hidden in Tibet, and a grand, overarching narrative about the spiritual evolution of humanity. For thousands of people who were deeply disillusioned by the rigid dogmas of traditional Christianity and the cold, unfeeling materialism of the Industrial Revolution, Theosophy offered a grand cosmic design. And at the absolute center of that design was a prophecy. A great soul would soon manifest on Earth to save humanity. One evening in 1909, a highly influential and deeply controversial leader within the society, Charles Webster Leadbeater, was walking along the Ojai beach. Leadbeater claimed to possess advanced clairvoyant abilities, asserting he could see the colorful spiritual auras of human beings. On that beach, he noticed a scrawny, malnourished boy playing in the surf with his younger brother. It was Krishnamurti. To the ordinary eye, the boy was just another impoverished child. But Leadbeater was stunned. He claimed that the boy's aura was entirely devoid of a single trace of selfishness, greed, or ego. It was, he declared, a perfectly empty vessel. Leadbeater walked back to his colleagues and made a staggering pronouncement. The world teacher has been found. This is where the quiet human tragedy of Krishnamurti's life begins. A living, breathing child was suddenly transformed into a collective projection. Powerful, highly educated Western adults descended upon him. Chief among them was Annie Besant, a brilliant, formidable British social reformer, passionate orator, and the president of the Theosophical Society. When Besant threw her massive prestige behind the boy, the machinery of prophecy locked into place. Krishnamurti and his intensely devoted younger brother Nitya were legally separated from their father after a bitter, highly publicized custody battle. Overnight, ordinary life vanished. They were scrubbed clean of their past. They were placed under the strict supervision of private tutors. They were dressed in the finest silks and taught to speak flawless aristocratic English. They were taught how to carry themselves in European high society. When you hand a child a cosmic destiny before they even have the psychological vocabulary to question it, you aren't just giving them an identity. You are trapping them inside a script. For the next decade, Krishnamurti lived inside a gilded cage, treated not as a boy who needed love and play, but as an artifact of a divine future. By 1911, the vague spiritual hope surrounding Krishnamurti had been completely institutionalized. The Theosophical Society established the Order of the Star in the East. This wasn't a casual, informal book club or a small fringe cult. It was a sophisticated, highly organized international machine. Suddenly, belief had a budget. Expectation had a mountain of paperwork. The order possessed its own international magazines, local committees in dozens of countries, massive donor funds, and vast tracts of donated land across Europe, India, and America. Thousands of members across the globe wore silver star pins, waiting on tenterhooks for the day the young Indian boy would fully channel the divine voice of the world teacher. Throughout his teens and early 20s, Krishnamurti was paraded across the globe. He was chauffeured to lavish country estates in England, walked through the elite drawing rooms of Paris, and stood before packed lecture halls. Yet those who observed him closely behind the scenes noted a profound, aching isolation. He was deeply uncomfortable with the adoration. He loved reading pulp fiction, working on sports cars, and playing sports far more than reading dense occult treatises. In this suffocating world of endless spiritual projection, Krishnamurti had exactly one real anchor to reality: his brother, Nitya. Nitya was brilliant, articulate, and fiercely protective of his older brother. Because Nitya had crossed that same strange border from their simple childhood in India into this surreal landscape of global prophecy, he was the only person alive who treated Krishnamurti as a human being rather than a symbol. When the weight of being a living idol became too heavy, Krishnamurti could look at Nitya and remember who he actually was. But by the early 1920s, the pressure cooker was reaching a breaking point. The international followers weren't looking at Krishnamurti the person. They were looking at a mirror of their own desires. If he coughed, it was interpreted as an occult clearing of negative energy. If he remained silent in a meeting, his silence was analyzed as a profound transmission of cosmic wisdom. The machinery was moving so fast that the young man inside it was losing any remaining room to simply exist. In 1922, looking for a climate that would soothe Nitya's worsening tuberculosis, the brothers traveled to a secluded valley in California called Ojai. Ojai was a revelation for Krishnamurti. It was far removed from the heavy institutional, gossip-laden atmosphere of the Theosophical headquarters in India or England. It offered wide, silent skies, the scent of wild sage, and an intense physical stillness. It gave him space. And when you give a person who has been heavily conditioned their entire life a moment of absolute space, the tectonic plates of their psyche begin to shift. It was during this summer in Ojai that Krishnamurti underwent a terrifying, agonizing physical and psychological crisis that his biographers simply refer to as the process. For months, he suffered from excruciating pain in his spine and neck, fits of semi-consciousness, trembling, and periods where he regressed into a childlike state, crying out for his mother, who had died when he was a boy. The people around him were bewildered and terrified. Theosophical leaders eagerly interpreted this suffering as the final spiritual surgery, the burning away of his human ego so that the world teacher could take full possession of his body. But regardless of how one interprets the process metaphysically, the psychological reality was clear. Krishnamurti was breaking down the identity that had been forced upon him since childhood. When he emerged from this intense crucible, his language began to subtly but noticeably change. He stopped using the complex, hierarchical vocabulary of theosophy. He stopped talking about initiations and masters. Instead, he began to speak of something entirely foreign to the organization that raised him: the absolute necessity of psychological freedom and direct, unmediated perception. Then came the event that would permanently shatter the prophecy. In late 1925, Krishnamurti was on a ship traveling from the United States to India. Nitya had remained behind in Ojai, desperately ill. Before leaving, Krishnamurti had been explicitly assured by Annie Besant and the clairvoyant lead beater that the hidden masters had guaranteed Nitya's safety, because Nitya was vital to the great spiritual work ahead. Midway across the ocean, a telegram was handed to Krishnamurti. Nitya was dead. The witness reports of Krishnamurti's reaction to this news are devastating. He was utterly destroyed. He wept continuously for days, his entire body shaking with a grief that shocked the passengers on the ship. This wasn't just the loss of a beloved brother, it was a profound metaphysical earthquake. The entire spiritual architecture he had been forced to rely on since he was 14 years old had failed its ultimate test. The sacred explanations, the infallible masters, the grand evolutionary design, none of it had protected the one human being he loved most. When Krishnamurti finally stepped off that ship, the boy who left had vanished. He did not become a shallow, bitter skeptic. Instead, his understanding of life deepened into something incredibly fierce. He realized that relying on second-hand certainties, spiritual promises, and external authorities was not just an intellectual mistake. It was a profound form of psychological cowardice that left human beings utterly unequipped to face the raw, unvarnished reality of suffering. The crack in the prophecy had become a canyon. Which brings us back to that fateful summer day in Holland, 1929. For 4 years following Nitya's death, the tension between Krishnamurti and the Theosophical leadership had been quietly building behind closed doors. The organization was still printing pamphlets, still collecting dues, still organizing massive camps, desperately trying to pretend that their messiah was still on script. But on August 3rd, before an audience of over 3,000 devoted followers and a stunned Annie Besant, Krishnamurti pulled the trigger. When he announced the dissolution of the Order of the Star, his words weren't a soft, poetic, philosophical musing. They were a direct, calculated assault on the very foundation of human belief. Let's look closely at what he actually meant when he said, "Truth is a pathless land." A path is an incredibly comforting concept. A path implies that someone else has already hacked their way through the terrifying jungle of existence. A path gives you a map, milestones, approved steps, a qualified guide, and above all, the reassuring promise that if you just follow the rules, you will safely arrive at the destination. A path reduces fear because it outsources the burden of uncertainty to someone else. Krishnamurti looked at his followers and ruthlessly stripped that comfort away. He told them that when you follow a path, you are not seeking truth, you are seeking security. He stated, because truth is limitless, unconditioned, unapproachable by any path whatsoever, it cannot be organized, nor should any organization be formed to lead or to coerce people along any particular path. The actual target of his speech wasn't just the Theosophical Society, nor was it just organized religion. The deeper target was human dependency. The human mind is profoundly lazy and deeply terrified of its own loneliness. It desperately wants a guru, a political ideology, a psychological method, or a spiritual system to step in and take away the terrifying burden of self-knowledge. We want someone else to tell us who we are and how we should live. Krishnamurti argued that the moment you look to another person or a system for spiritual authority, you have completely abandoned freedom. You have chosen a comfortable imitation of life over the living reality. What makes this act almost unique in the history of ideas is what he voluntarily walked away from. Most leaders lose their power because of a scandal, a political coup, or a rival taking it from them. Krishnamurti stood at the absolute peak of a global empire built entirely to worship him, and he chose to walk out of it. He didn't wait for the crowds to leave, he dismissed them. He surrendered thousands of acres of land, massive trust funds, international prestige, and the security of a guaranteed living godhood, choosing instead to step into the world completely alone. With no institutional backing whatsoever, the shock in the camp was tangible. People wept openly. Some felt profoundly betrayed. They had given decades of their lives to a promise that had just been torn up in front of their eyes. But this is where the story takes a fascinating, incredibly complex turn. The Order of the Star was dead, but Krishnamurti did not retire into a quiet, private life. For the next 57 years, until his death in 1986, he traveled the globe continuously, speaking to massive audiences, writing books, and holding intense dialogues. And this presents us with the ultimate paradox of his life. How does a man who completely rejects the concept of followers spend his entire existence speaking to people who insist on following him? After 1929, Krishnamurti completely stripped his language of any mystical or esoteric flavor. He didn't talk about heaven, hell, God, or the soul. Instead, his work became a form of radical, deeply intense psychological inquiry. He turned his attention to the immediate daily reality of human suffering, focusing intensely on one foundational concept: conditioning. Krishnamurti argued that from the moment we are born, our minds are systematically programmed. We are conditioned by our culture, our geographical location, our family's religious beliefs, our formal education, our nationalistic pride, and our personal traumas. Because of this conditioning, we view the world through a thick, distorted lens of prejudices, memories, and fears. This is where his philosophical knife cuts deepest. A person might stand up proudly and say, "I have chosen my religion freely," or "I am a proud defender of my nation." Krishnamurti would look at them and ask, "Yes, but what conditioned the self that is making that choice?" If you were born in a different country to a different family, you would be fiercely defending an entirely different set of dogmas. Therefore, your choices are not free at all. They are the mechanical output of a pre-programmed computer. Because he understood how desperately the human mind craves authority, Krishnamurti spent decades actively frustrating serious spiritual seekers. People would travel from all over the world to sit before him, begging for a practical method. They would ask, "How do I meditate? How do I quiet my mind? Tell me what breathing technique to use. Give me a practice." And Krishnamurti would flatly refuse. He saw a profound danger in any spiritual method or technique. He argued that if you practice a specific method every morning, whether it's repeating a mantra, focusing on your breath, or visualizing a light, you are simply training your mind to be mechanical. You are creating a new habit, a new cage. The person who successfully practices a method for 10 years hasn't discovered freedom. They have just built a highly disciplined spiritual ego. They have optimized their conditioning rather than breaking free from it. Instead of a method, he demanded something far more difficult and immediate: choiceless awareness. He asked people to watch their minds in real time, right in the middle of daily life, without an ounce of judgment or condemnation. Watch how anger flares up in your chest when someone insults you. Watch the sharp, ugly sting of jealousy when a colleague receives praise. Watch your desperate urge to belong to a political party or a religious group just so you can feel safe. Watch your fears before you try to escape them through television, alcohol, or spiritual books. He insisted that you must look at your mind the way a scientist looks at a specimen through a microscope, without liking or disliking it. If you try to suppress your anger, or if you tell yourself you shouldn't be jealous, you have divided your mind into two camps: the good watcher and the bad emotion. This was his most profound psychological insight, one that he explored deeply in historic marathon conversations with the renowned quantum physicist David Bohm. Krishnamurti stated that this division between the observer and the observed is the root cause of all human conflict. We say, "I am angry, and I must control my anger." But Krishnamurti pointed out a radical truth: the controller is the controlled. The I who is trying to suppress the anger is made of the exact same conditioned thoughts as the anger itself. There is no separate, pure soul inside you looking at your thoughts. You are your thoughts. When the mind fully realizes this, when it stops trying to run away, change, or fix itself, and simply observes its own movement with absolute intensity, Krishnamurti claimed that the conditioning dissolves on its own, unlocking a state of profound, unforced silence. Yet, despite the undeniable clarity of his insights, Krishnamurti's life and legacy are tangled up in deep, unavoidable complications. If we are to examine his story honestly, we have to look at the friction points. The early environment that birthed him was rife with occult theater, financial scandals, and intense power struggles. And even late into his life, long after he had walked away from Theosophy, the institutions built around his secular work, the Krishnamurti foundations in India, England, and America, became battlegrounds for legal disputes, asset control, and copyright battles over his recorded talks. Following his death, biographies written by people within his inner circle revealed deeply human contradictions in his private life, including a secret, decades-long affair with the wife of his closest associate. These historical realities shouldn't be brought up merely for the sake of salacious gossip. They matter because they illustrate a profound universal human truth. A teaching against authority does not automatically free the listeners from their obsession with authority. The human mind is an absolute genius at turning anything into a psychological shelter. We can turn traditional religion into a shelter. We can turn political activism into a shelter. And ironies of ironies, we can turn an anti-guru's teachings into a new guru culture. Throughout his life, Krishnamurti would look out at audiences filled with people who had been listening to him speak for 40 years, and he would ask them, with a mixture of sorrow and frustration, "Why are you here? You are still angry. You are still jealous. You are still afraid. You haven't changed a bit. You have just replaced your old religious vocabulary with my phrases." People flocked to his lectures precisely because he told them not to follow anyone. They turned the phrase "truth is a pathless land" into a comforting dogma, a slogan to be memorized, and in doing so, they completely missed the point. They used the man who refused to be a master as their ultimate master. It is the tragic, recurring loop of the human search for truth. In February 1986, Jiddu Krishnamurti died in Ojai, California. The quiet valley where his worldview had first fractured open 64 years earlier became the place where his life finally came to a close, at the age of 90. The sickly, vague boy discovered on a lonely Indian beach had lived one of the most astonishing lives of the modern era. He had been an imperial project, a rejected messiah, a reluctant global icon, and a ruthless psychological iconoclast. He left behind no churches, no holy books, no step-by-step instructions, and no comforting prayers. Instead, he left behind an ongoing radical challenge that refuses to give us the easy answers we constantly look for. Truth is a pathless land is not an invitation to intellectual laziness. It is not a permission slip for chaotic moral relativism, nor does it mean that every casual opinion is as good as wisdom. It means something far more terrifying. No one else can do the work of seeing for you. No ancient scripture can hand you virtue. No political ideology can solve your internal violence. No charismatic teacher can grant you freedom. No quote can replace your own immediate burning attention. And no video can replace the painful, necessary work of looking directly into the mirror of your own mind. In 1909, a group of desperate adults built a spectacular golden cage around a child, fully convinced they had found a shortcut to save the world. In 1929, the man inside that cage broke it to pieces in front of their eyes, leaving them with the heavy, beautiful, and radical responsibility of having absolutely no path at all. And that is precisely why Krishnamurti's story still matters today. He didn't cure our psychological confusion, and he didn't solve the problem of human authority. He did something far more permanent. He held up an unyielding mirror, showing us that the cage we are trying to escape isn't built by gurus or institutions. It is built by our own desperate refusal to stand alone. If you want to keep exploring the parts of reality the world is too afraid to look at, hit subscribe. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and stay tuned for the next journey into the pathless land.